Welcome to the Heal, Thrive, Dream podcast, where trauma survivors become healthy thrivers. Each month, we'll feature a theme in the trauma recovery and empowerment field. To promote your recovery, healing, and learning how to build dreams, here's your host, Karen Robinson, transformational coach and therapist.
Hello, welcome back to the Heal, Thrive, Dream podcast. Today, our guest is the one and only Amanda Blackwood. And I'm going to read part of her bio, and we decided that she would either read the rest or paraphrase, just because I didn't want you to hear me too long this morning or afternoon, whenever you're listening. There are many hats that Amanda Blackwood wears. She's an author, public speaker, podcast host, survivor, but ultimately she's a woman who transformed her trauma into resilience and strength. When Amanda finally managed to get away from the man who was trafficking her, she was 31 years old and didn't know what she'd gone through, even had a name, much less how to deal with the pain of feeling like a broken person, unworthy of love, and filled with so much anger. On a freezing cold day in 2018, she saw former trafficked people standing strong and showing their beautiful resiliency on a stage at an anti-trafficking event. At that moment, she finally knew where her purpose in life would be. So, Amanda, what's that purpose? What would you say?
I'm a fighter. I fight for all those who've been silenced. One of the most shocking statistics that I learned that day about human trafficking is that only 2% of all victims actually survive. I'm here to speak for those who can't.
Yeah. So, welcome to our show today, and thank you so much for being here. I think you have a powerful story to share. And so anything I miss in your bio that you want to elaborate on, that's fine, like about your summits, your radio programs, your books, and where you live. Go ahead and fill us in.
Oh my gosh, I've done so much since that day. So that event in 2018 kind of catapulted me into this whole new world. 1 year later, I was actually standing on that same stage talking about my story for the first time in front of a large audience. Since then, I've been able to speak on a multitude of stages. I've been a keynote speaker for international summits. I've been on radio programs. I've been on probably, I want to say, around 200 different podcasts. And I've written over a dozen books at this point. I do have 2 podcasts of my own, one that focuses on interviewing other authors of trauma, and the other that discusses the long-term consequences of trauma and how to fight back against them to have a better life. I now live in Denver, Colorado with my 6 amazing rescue cats and my wonderful husband, and they all do their very best to keep me sane.
Okay, so I'm sorry for my voice. I don't know what happened to it. So before we start recording, I asked you what you would be comfortable sharing. And you said that you were going to be pretty open about that, which is really wonderful, because I've had some other people who've been trafficked and they weren't ready to share their story. Mm-hmm. And so that's hard too, because that's what connects my audience to people is knowing that there's themes in common or symptoms in common even. So what about your story are you comfortable sharing? Like, I think it might be helpful too to know what age it started and a little bit on how you got yourself in that situation. Not that it's your fault at all, because it's not. Yeah.
Right. But I did put myself into very precarious situations that kind of would lead to this. But that came from early childhood abuse. So while the trafficking didn't happen until I was 18, I was trafficked 3 different times in my life. Most survivors of human trafficking have one very common theme in their lives, and that is early childhood abuse and trauma. I'm no stranger to that myself. I was molested at the age of 4 years old, and my life kind of shifted in that direction to where I was being treated as a sex object throughout my entire childhood. I was molested again at 12, again at 13 by an uncle, again at 15, again at 16, and raped at 17. So by the time I was trafficked the first time when I was 18 years old, I had already learned how to keep all of this stuff inside and to internalize it, blame myself for it, understand that there was no help available to me, and realize that that's all my body is to anybody else. And that if they're going to use it however they want anyway, I might as well, get something out of it. And in some cases, that was a place to stay. I was exploiting myself. In other cases, I was being exploited for them to be able to line their pockets.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that, because I think it's easy to shame ourselves, put guilt on ourselves, internalize, I'm not worthy, this is my fault. When the truth is, we learn those messages in early childhood when abuse happens to us. Then we do put ourselves in risky situations because we don't think we're worth a damn.
Right,
so
right.
I appreciate you sharing that.
We also grow up being abused by the people that we trust and love. So we draw this connection between the two to where if those people who we have in our life do not hurt us, that means they don't love us.
Mm-hmm. That's pretty powerful, isn't it? We could let that sink in for a second.
It's a hard cycle to break.
What would you say were your major symptoms from your abuse? The major things that felt off or wrong, mentally, physically, spiritually?
Absolutely everything in me was broken. Later on, what I described as in my final trafficking incident was that every single time people were doing this to me, it felt like they were taking away slices of my soul. There were pieces of me that were missing. I grew up with very little to no self-esteem of any sort, good or bad. It just didn't exist. I felt like I was less than human. I was constantly bullied in school. I didn't stand up for myself nearly as often as I probably could or should have. I was a doormat. I hid from the world for so long. I was afraid of being myself because I was terrified that if I was myself, people wouldn't like me or they would hurt me more. There were so many signs and symptoms. There are so many things that in my research now, researching trauma reactions, I'm realizing that of this massive list I've compiled, I experienced most of them. The lack of being able to trust anybody, the inability to speak my mind, the people pleasing, I used to call myself an empath until I understood that it wasn't being an empath. It was hypervigilance because I saw everybody in the room and I immediately assessed who was the most dangerous to me. So I latched on to that person to try to read them. I saw it as empathy because I could read what kind of a mood they were in, and they were in a bad mood. It was a scary and dangerous place for me to be, and I needed to be aware at all times. I've tried to educate other people on what, where the empath idea comes from since then. And just recently I saw a video from Teal Swan that just summed it up so beautifully about empathy is completely different from being an empath. And empathy is completely different from hypervigilance. And hypervigilance has been a huge part of my life since I was very young. It also manifests physically. So I have Crohn's disease, thyroid disease, and chronic hives. And all three of these are autoimmune diseases. And in studies linking back to, I think it's in 2015, they linked this to early childhood trauma.
Yep, the ACE study. Yep. Yeah, before I knew the ACE study exists as a young therapist, first of all, I don't know how it is that there can be this field of therapists and not somehow all of us find out about the ACE study. It trickled, that news of that study trickled down. And I don't understand why supervisors, I thought I was being well read in scholarly articles, but that study escaped me. But I was seeing in my practice that a lot of my survivors had a lot of symptoms that were the same physically. I knew what the emotional ones were, but a lot of them were having chronic migraines. A lot of them were having huge issues with fatigue. A lot of them had diagnosis of fibromyalgia. And I was like, this is more than a coincidence. And that's when I really started doing my own research and training myself, like the impact physically trauma can have. And it's really been mind-blowing. I'm pretty convinced that the impact of trauma can wreak havoc on any part of our body from head to toe. It can wreak havoc. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And there's such a deep connection between mental health and physical health too. Yeah. And if we don't,
we only have one body.
Right. Exactly. We got to squish all of this in here somehow, and if it's not working in synchronicity, then we've got some major issues. Ever since my hives just recently came back, I've been dealing with them since 2019. And they just recently came back, and I had to stop my physical routines of working out and that kind of stuff because it's very uncomfortable. But I've noticed that as soon as I stopped doing any kind of a workout routine and having that physical release, my mood started to shift, and I needed to find other outlets to be able to elevate my mood, because my favorite line from the movie Legally Blonde was, endorphins make people happy. Happy people don't kill people. And I kind of keep that. Working out and exercising is so important. So while I can't do a physical activity workout in my bedroom, I still go out and go for a walk around the block.
You heard it here first, people. Exercise so you don't become homicidal. Well, I think having hives be one of my physical symptoms, I think that would make me pretty agitated too. Like, how have you been coping with that? That sounds very unpleasant. How do you get through it?
I have a long-handled paintbrush sticking out of a bottle of calamine lotion, and that's no exaggeration. I left it downstairs, or I'd show you. Every morning, the first thing I do is wake up, take my medications, my allergy medications and stuff, and then I head downstairs to contemplate what it is that I'm going to make for breakfast while I'm painting the calamine lotion on it. But having something else to look forward to doing, I love cooking, is so important to me because it takes my focus off of what I'm currently doing and focusing on that's making me physically miserable, and thinking about things that make me mentally happy. I'm going to be going in the kitchen and creating something new today, or I'm going to be digging up a recipe from the recesses of my memory that I haven't made in a year or so. I mean, this morning it was jalapeno cheddar grits with bacon and a fried egg on top. Oh, it's
sounds great, except for the jalapeno part. It would burn my tongue. Wow, so you're a great cook then. That's one of your coping strategies. Yeah, very nice.
And I know that this podcast is pre-recorded, so I'm going to speak about this in past tense, but June 1st, I had my first ever cookbook come out called Surviving in the Kitchen, Recipes for Life, Love, and a Full Stomach.
Awesome. So that's going to be on Amazon? Let me write it down.
It's primarily going to be on Barnes & Noble. I'm a big supporter of Barnes & Noble and the charities and stuff that they work with.
Okay, say the title one more time.
Surviving in the Kitchen.
In the Kitchen. Okay, thank you. So I'll put it in the show notes for people to purchase. Awesome. Okay, so I want to ask, we've talked about like the physical pieces of your symptoms. Mental health wise, is it the typical, you said hyperarousal, but the typical anxiety, depression fight, or no?
Definitely a lot of that in there. I got out of trafficking in 2011, and in 2018, 2019 is when I discovered that my former trafficker had made me famous on a pornography website by sharing a bunch of photos and videos that he took during the molestations and rapes. My mental health at that point had already been struggling, but it was on a baseline, and I thought I had hit rock bottom and just stayed there. But what happened at that point was I became incredibly depressed, and I hit this downward spiral very quickly. So I got involved with an anti-trafficking organization out here that put me in touch with a light, and a light pairs survivors of trafficking with legal services. And they were
that's good.
helping. Yes.
Yeah.
And they were helping me to get this stuff taken down off the pornography websites. But the anti-trafficking organization also put me in touch with a therapist. And I'd had a very bad experience with a therapist when I was a 15-year-old kid. And I didn't trust therapists.
Mm-hmm.
But the lady who was suddenly, thrust into the position of being my therapist was someone that I was already familiar with because she had come to some of the survivor group meetings that I had been a part of through this anti-trafficking organization. And I didn't know that Amy was a therapist. So when they told me that she was who it was I was going to be talking to, there had already been this level of rapport built. And I knew her well enough to know that I could trust her with my story. And she wasn't going to be going out there and blabbing or trying to immediately stick me on medications that I didn't want to take for a variety of reasons of my own. She worked really hard with me. She was very, very patient, but she was also one of the most straightforward people I've ever met in my life. And that's what I needed right then. She pulled no punches. She told it like it was. She didn't traumatize me in any way, but she also didn't worry about having to be incredibly delicate with me because she knew me. And that, I think, is what we need the most from a therapist, is somebody who understands who we are. But the only way that the therapist is ever going to know who we are is if we talk to them. So it's like this weird cycle. We have to figure out if this is somebody we can get along with before we can trust them. And then the therapist has to have a strong enough foothold in the world of therapy to understand what the person is needing. There has to be that pairing.
Yeah.
It's so important.
That was so beautifully stated. And I get really frustrated with insurance or some organizations I partnered over the years. They want to pay for a client to get 12 sessions of CPT, and that's it. And I'm like, well, would it be okay before I start CBT if I got to know them first? It's like, they're not going to want to start that on day. I wouldn't want to start on that on day one with anybody I didn't know. Like, it's a little crazy sometimes what we with insurance. And I mean, that people mean well when they want to do support for survivors, but they're not getting the whole picture of it. How trust and engagement and positive regard for each other is so important. It's important for the therapist to also not to be textbook, not to be cookie cutter, like treating each survivor as an individual with their own individual symptoms, even though there's overlap with survivors, but still, this is their perspective. They have different strengths. They have, different backgrounds to it. So to account to all of that, it can't be cookie cutter. It's kind of.
I mean, just like every single person is different, every single trauma is different, and how our brains are rewired is different because it's all based on the trauma itself. There will never be a one size fits all for anything.
Yeah, I agree. And I asked how your traumas impacted you spiritually or morally.
I grew up, I really want to address the spiritual side of this first. I grew up in a household that claimed to be Methodist Christian, but that never went to church. My family was very abusive. My mother was mentally and emotionally abusive. My father was physically abusive. My brother was the one who molested me when I was little. So that was all of my immediate family. My dad was in the military, so we moved around a lot. Even if we did find a church somewhere, we would have been moving too quickly for us to really feel established there. So when I was probably around 8, I started running away from home on Sundays and going to church. And it was because I felt this deep calling to go. I needed to know more about God. We said prayer at dinner time in my household, but it always felt empty. It felt fake. I needed to know more. So I started going to church, and I would get in trouble for this. And that wasn't because I was, running away from home, but it was because I was going to what's considered a non-denominational church. And my mother would get very mad because she said, they're not Methodist. They're not going to have the same values as us. And we don't want you getting confused. So I begged them to take me to a Methodist church. And for years they didn't. When they finally did, it was for, I think, maybe 2 or 3 months, and then we stopped going. So I always needed that Christian education and didn't have it. And when I was being trafficked and abused for all those years, I rebelled against religion. I wanted nothing to do with it. I was disappointed. I was angry at God. I didn't understand how something like this could continue to happen to me and why this was the life that I was handed. And when I was in Scotland during my final time being trafficked, I was 31 years old. I nearly committed suicide. And God showed up in a very unusual way through the eyes of a 4-year-old child who was the only person in days who could actually see me, not just look at me, but see me. And this child could see that I was in pain, and I could see it written all over his face. And it was in that moment that rather than committing suicide, I ran back to what was my prison, essentially. And I was thanking God the whole way, because I knew that if he was going to show up in that way, if he was going to be there for me and he was going to stop me from doing what I was going to do, had to be a purpose behind that. And I was thanking him for keeping me alive, because that meant there was something more. There was something that would come next. And I had no idea what it was going to be. And I had to put up with several more months of what I had already been going through before I was able to find my way out. But since then, I have been pretty well established in a couple of different churches. The first one, when I moved out to Colorado, I was helping and learning about the audio engineering side of things. And the church that I'm now a part of, my husband is the audio engineer. And it's such a cool thing for me. We go to church twice a week. We go on either Saturday evenings or Sunday mornings, whichever fits our schedule better. And then on Wednesday nights. And it's always such a perfect message every week. Whatever it is I'm going through, it fits. And I just love this. And what was the other question? The spiritual side and...
Or more, like the moral injury. But I feel like you...
Yeah.
I mean, do you have more to say about that? The moral injury piece?
I have become far more conservative with who I am and how much of myself I show. And I think a lot of that comes from, for a long time, I was doing something called trauma vomiting, where I was taking my story and throwing all of it out there and traumatizing other people around me with details they didn't necessarily need. And I learned how to kind of rein that in a bit. Now, morally, I feel like it's important to share the story, but also important to know where the lines are so I don't constantly traumatize other people and trigger them.
Yeah, it can be a balance. Even for this show, there's a couple of times where people went into detail I definitely didn't ask for, and I was like, okay, maybe they just needed to say it. But then I was a little worried about the audience because I'm not there I can help my guests maybe kind of be okay before we end, but the audience I was worried about too. So yeah, I get what you're saying. It is a delicate dance. And I think too, when we share our stories, the huge piece is not necessarily I had this symptom and this was wrong. I mean, that's important for education, but I think what's powerful is the hope that comes from our recovery. So I heard that you ended up with a therapist that you trusted, and that's been helpful. But tell us a little more about your healing journey. Like, what was really, really helpful for you in that?
I've always been a writer. I have, we mentioned earlier, I've got over a dozen books out by now. This is all since 2018. I have been a writer my entire life, starting at a very young age. And this was hugely helpful for me for a long time, even before the last incident of trafficking. I would write down things that, hey, I'm feeling this way today in a journal. And then I would explore, why am I feeling this way? What does this remind me of? I didn't realize at the time that I was putting myself through a lesser form of EMDR. I was doing an association of what I was feeling and why I was feeling this way and what it's triggering and all these memories and stuff. So at the end of my therapy in 2020, Amy asked me in November, she said, well, what are you going to do next? I don't think that there's much more that I can do to help you. You've done incredibly well. We've gotten so far. And of course, I'm going to keep checking in with you. and I'm always here for you no matter what. But what are you going to do next? And I said, Amy, I think I'm going to write my book. And she said, oh, that's great. It's November right now. Let's skip the Christmas season. I'll check in with you early January. We'll see how you're doing on that and see if there's anything that you wanted to talk about or just hang out for a minute. And she reached out to me in January and she said, so how's it going? Oh, everything's going well. No. How's your book going? Oh, I finished that 2 weeks ago. 350 pages while I was working 2 full-time jobs. All of this just came pouring out of me. And that was probably the most healing thing that I could have done for myself. So then Amy asked me, now what are you going to do? Now, I know you love to take the bull by the horns and you're very much hands-on with what it is that you're doing in your own healing. What are you going to do now? I said, I don't know. She said, why don't you try painting? I said, I've never painted before in my life. I don't know how to paint. The only thing I've ever been experienced with painting was the calamine lotion and my spots, So she sent over canvases and paintbrush and acrylic paints and everything that I would possibly need to start painting. Within 3 months.
Now that's a therapist.
Oh, yeah. She was amazing.
She's amazing.
Within 3 months, I sold my first painting.
Oh, I wasn't expecting you to say that. I thought you were going to say I threw paint.
Within a year, I had been written up in the Chicago Tribune. I had a painting that was sold to an anti-trafficking organization that houses survivors in Chicago, as well as an essay about how we have to carry our own baggage through life until we find a safe place to set it down. I ended up selling my stuff internationally after that. And just last year, I was picked up and put into a local art gallery that's now closed, but my stuff was in a gallery, and that was the height of it for me. If I never do anything else with my art other than paint my own book covers, I'll be a very happy person.
You're such a badass.
You. Right?
Yeah. Wow. Okay, so before we start talking about the books you've written, I want to ask, how did you, I guess I'm hoping this, if I'm making an assumption, correct me. So I'm guessing you've done some relationship work and relationship healing before you married. So I'd love to know, how did you get to the point where you didn't trust people, especially men, to the point where you could fall in love and trust? I'm guessing he's a healthy, wonderful person. God, I hope so. Let's pray. Do the crosses too. Don't tell me he beats you. I just can't handle that on my podcast today. Okay, tell me that story.
The only thing he ever beats me about is he beats me upstairs every once in a while because I get a little winded with the hives and all the other stuff I got going on.
Okay. All right, I will have him arrested then.
My husband is an incredible human being. When it came to meeting him and figuring things out, I had already gone through so much of my own journey of healing. And then I got together with Amy and she helped me through everything. And then I wrote my book. I got baptized in April of 2021. My autobiography was published June 19th, which is my 10-year anniversary of freedom from trafficking of 2021. And I met him in July of 2021. I had gone through such a transformation from the broken person I had been just 2 years before, even just the year before. But when I met him, he knew this about me. He read my book, which was huge, and I was terrified of that at first, but he read the whole thing and told me that if I could still have this capacity to love and still be able to care about other people after everything I'd been through, he needed a lot more of that in his life. He is a godly man, but he also went through a brutal divorce several years ago. After raising 2 kids and being with his first wife for 20 years, this divorce was really ugly. It was horrible for him. He fought really hard to keep it as long as he could. And when the writing was on the wall, instead of just throwing in the towel and saying, fine, whatever, he went into therapy. He did the work on himself. She had accused him of things that he wanted to know, am I really that person that she's accused me of? Have I done the things that she claims that I've done? When he went into the therapy, he went into men's groups. He was involved in church small groups, recovery group, all kinds of stuff to really focus on who he was as an individual and to address issues and concerns. I've told him multiple times since the day that we met that he is incredibly patient. And when I stand on stage and I talk about my relationships now and how they've completely transformed from anybody and everybody, please come love me, to I have a select few people in my life because these are healthy relationships and I have healthy boundaries now. I tell people all the time that he is incredibly patient with me. He's very kind and gentle. And one day when we were on our way home from an event where I had, again, talked about how patient he was, he told me in the car, he's like, I have to tell you something. What's that, Kyle? He said, you are the only person in my life that has ever accused me of being patient. And I told him, I said, I don't know why it is that you're so patient with me, because I do recognize that he can be really impatient with other people. And he said, well, when it comes to you, it's natural. I know what you've been through, and I understand that there's certain things that aren't going to come naturally to you about XYZ. And so I understand that I have to be a little bit more patient with you, and it just comes naturally, and I don't even think about it. That's the big difference for our relationship. It's not only does he love me and he's patient with me, but he respects me. He respects me enough to know that this is a part of my past and that certain things are going to be painful and triggering, and that if he's a little bit patient with me, I will figure that out too.
That is really remarkable. Yeah. Okay, I like Kyle. High five him later for me.
He's wonderful.
Yeah. So now tell me about your books. Like in a nutshell, what do you want to share with the audience in terms of what they might enjoy reading about? Like you mentioned a cookbook. That's very interesting. You had an autobiography. What's the name of your autobiography?
That one is called Custom Justice. And if you
Custom
look at
Justice. Okay. Wow.
My face on it. So if you see all this stuff in the background, all these 1940s antiques and stuff, I actually do wear this stuff at the 1940s ball. I used to be a museum guide at the Museum of Tolerance in Beverly Hills. I became a part of the living exhibit. What I'm wearing in this picture is actually a 1940s necklace and a 1940s evening gown, 1940s hair. I do all of this myself, and this is definitely a passion of mine. But the reason that I chose this for the cover is because it's also a heavily photoshopped image of me. It's gotten rid of all the wrinkles and all the lines. That's because this is the face that the world saw. But who I really was between the ears. And that's everything on the inside. It was important for me to show that, even though this is the face that everybody saw, I wasn't exactly happy. So the photographer was a little confused about the project when I hired him. But when I explained it to him, he donated his services. He wanted to do this. So photographer's amazing.
Well, that's a beautiful story too. Go ahead.
Thank you. My other books, Surviving in the Kitchen, that's the cookbook. So this one, it's got a lot of little hints and little stories about when I was learning these recipes or where I figured out that I wanted to learn how to make this recipe. And I tell people all the time that I learned how to cook out of self-defense. My mother hated cooking. She was a terrible cook for most things. She did a mean tuna noodle casserole and she made the best biscuits on the planet, but that's about her limit. So I learned how to cook because I loved food and I wanted to learn how to nourish not just my body, but my soul. And food is a huge part of that for me. So I've got recipes in there from the time when I lost 50 pounds in 4 months, eating my own cooking and was very healthy doing it. And I've got other recipes in there that are for anything but weight loss. And it talks about those differences too, about, when you just need that comfort food, this is a great comfort food to have, like a turkey sriracha meatloaf that has caramelized onions sprinkled over the top. Oh, it's one of my favorites. But
Good God, you're making me hungry.
I do also have a science fiction series. It's called The Unlikely Survivors. And it's a 3-book series about a group of survivors that are trying to escape Los Angeles during an apocalypse. I tell people all the time on that one, who better to predict the end of the world than somebody who's already lived it? But probably my personal favorite is a book called The Road We Left Behind. And this book is about not my life, but my grandmother's life. She was portrayed as a wing walker in the 1930s and 40s. It talks about a real life murder mystery in my family. It covers her first love, who was not my grandfather, and why things didn't work out between them and how heartbroken she was. But she was a remarkably tough woman. She overcame so much in her life that so many people were never even aware of, that I knew I had to tell the story of her life. And I didn't get a chance to do this until after she had already passed away. But I have to believe that she would read this book and she would be grinning ear to ear to know that this is the way that I saw her. She was amazing. She was my inspiration. You know, in my darkest days, when I didn't want to keep going, I did, because I knew that her blood flowed in my veins. If she could be that strong, if she could make it through, I had a shot too.
Beautiful. Well, this has been so, I don't know what the word is, but I've really enjoyed our time together so far. That sounds weird whenever we talk about trauma. What I mean is like the hopeful and inspirational parts of it. So I'm really appreciative. And for our guests out there, you know, you have your books. How do you help survivors other than your writing? Like, do you do any coaching? Do you have any courses, workshops, or not so much?
I'm currently building a video module to where people can afford to purchase a series of videos to help them get through fighting against trauma reactions, learning what those long-term consequences are of not dealing with them, and finding healthy coping mechanisms to be able to fight back against them. I do have a mentorship. I don't call it coaching. I call it a mentorship, because a lot of times coaches want to ask people very personal questions. I don't feel like I'm not a therapist. I'm not a counselor. People don't need to tell me their deepest, darkest, most horrible secrets about the trauma that they've survived, but I can still help them to get through some of the trauma reactions that they're dealing with. So I have the mentorship. I do have the video modules that I'm currently building, and I do have a workbook series that I'm writing. The first book is already out. It's on the stages of trauma. The second book is about the trauma reactions. The third book will be about healthy boundaries. And the fourth will be about how to support a survivor. So these are the Growth from Darkness workbooks. I also have a podcast called Growth from Darkness. And I have another one called The Survivors, where I interview other triumphant authors who have overcome their own traumas and then written about them. So lots of ways for people to try and be encouraged. And always, I'm available to talk to people and to set up the mentorship programs. If they reach out to me through my email or through my Facebook page, I can work with people one-on-one.
So the best way to get you then to work with you is through your social media. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes, I am very active on my Facebook page.
Facebook primarily. Okay, great, because we have that. Okay, any final words you want to say to encourage those listening today that might be kind of in a dark space?
Always. No matter how dark it is, there is growth possible from the darkness. You can get through this even if you have to ask for help. And not knowing that you have options is the same thing as not having options. So see what there is available to you. Reach out to somebody, reach out to me, reach out to your host here. Talk to somebody. We can find ways to be able to get you out of whatever it is that you're going through and get you the help that you need.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Amanda, for being a guest with us today. Your story's powerful. It is. But you know that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening in today. Please join us next week, same day and time. Also, I would love for you to check out my website, healthrivedream.com.